alle schipashkirenlar o Baba mulenu ba Eshanil dunyehi mulenu nach kanuk Baba Getamiken ulanakam haulanekach Saun hamul sekuri kanal Kula hingrilar O Baba mulenu ba Eshanil dunyehi molenu nach kanuk Baba Farengio, Gringio, let a word, Kingio, Farengio, Gringio, let a word, Stellam penotige due, Stellam penotige due, Stellam penotige due, Stellam pure log, Stellam penotige due, Stellam penotige due, Stellam penotige due, Stellam pure log, Kinio, Farenio, Gringio, let a word, Nianerelruayu, pure guanach relog, Nianerelruayu, pure guanach relog, Kinio, Farenio, Gringio, let a word, Honna misendunu, Giano kundes remach klauch, Honna misendunu, Giano kundes remach klauch, Kinio, Farenio, Gringio, let a word, Kinio, Farenio, Gringio, let a word. Maljes morne koalige mot klare volje, Maljes morne koalige mot vahirage, Maljes morne koalige mot klare volje, Maljes morne koalige mot vahirage. Schau wirklich schlachen neder, schau das erkläre, schau wirklich schlachen es kann ich aben geschieri, schau wirklich schlachen neder, schau das erkläre, schau wirklich schlachen es kann ich aben geschieri. Maljes morne koalige mot klare volje, Maljes morne koalige mot vahirage, Maljes morne koalige mot klare volje, Maljes morne koalige mot vahirage. Schau wirklich schlachen neder, schau das erkläre, schau wirklich schlachen es kann ich aben geschieri, schau wirklich schlachen neder, schau das erkläre, schau wirklich schlachen es kann ich aben geschieri. Etaragar gavaramesh galachtaun, etaragar gavaramesh galachtaun, etaragar gavaramesh galachtaun. Ich checken ganaraket narapala khaliqin. Shaqtu tu shaqtu balahu, shaqtu tu shaqtu balahu, shaqtu tu shaqtu balahu. Shaqavasin jana bala penamal chinganau. Etaragar gavaramesh galachtaun, etaragar gavaramesh galachtaun, etaragar gavaramesh galachtaun. Ich checken ganaraket narapala khaliqin. Shaqtu tu shaqtu balahu, shaqtu tu shaqtu balahu, shaqtu tu shaqtu balahu. Ito es nana machina halaka khalagau. Spaloch na huidin tu. Siete kopedek na skupen arawad. Hui mi kan koyat fak na hui. Hanikia na las nam khdia. Sanik kutam na molai. Uadela kovigahi. Uadela kovipia. Rui mangurch na skuapen ara.
Morning, everybody. Yes? Welcome to the Focus on Let's Talk TV panel. If you were planning to be at the international panel, it's next door. We're in the primetime home stretch, so bravo to so many people making it this far. So we're almost there. So my name is Mark Sege. I'm the Senior VP of Policy based with the CMPA based here in Ottawa. I just announced, I'm following a script here that people prepared for me, so forgive me. This is an interactive session, so if you have questions, feel free to kind of ask for a microphone. There'll be microphones on the floor, or you can use the famous PTiO hashtag. I believe there's going to leave some time for questions at the end. Peter, is that right? And Peter, speaking of Peter, Peter's our moderator for today. Let me tell you a little bit about Peter. So Peter, don't? I thought you vetted this. Peter is clearly a primetime veteran, first and foremost. He's also a lawyer and engineer with 20 years of experience in the broadcast and the telecommunications industry, in both private practice and in senior executive positions. Peter, in his spare time, which I understand he doesn't have too much of, but in his spare time, he's also chair of Interactive Ontario, which is the trade association that represents, obviously, Ontario's digital media. Now they found the switch. Digital media sector. So I'm going to hand it off to Peter. Welcome, everybody, and have a great session.
Thanks, Mark. I have to say I'm astounded how many of you are actually here. Mark kind of stole my joke, but I was going to say that if you thought this was a breakfast television taping with Marilyn Dennis, you are in the wrong place, because we actually affectionately call this panel the Wonk panel. And that was our working title. But some of us actually took it as a badge of pride, but some of us didn't. Well, you outed yourself. I wasn't going to actually out you, but anyway, here we are. What I was going to suggest just to start is, why don't we just do very quick intros, your name, rank, and serial number, but tell us something about your personal relationship with your television.
Okay, my name is Asha Daniere. I'm Executive Vice President for Business Affairs.
Do I have a... No, I don't have another mic.
Maybe I'll just yell.
How about we skip over you to Kevin, and then we'll get you hooked up.
I don't know, I'm not sure if my mic's working. Is my mic working?
I think your transmitter's been, the switch has been
sat on
bumped,
it?
possibly.
The problem?
There we go.
Okay.
Is it you back on? Okay. We're going to check
Hello,
everybody's
hello.
transmitter.
Testing,
I good?
Testing. Okay, Asha Daniere, Business Affairs and Legal for Blue Ant Media. My relationship with my television is that it has been, I'm sure like many of us in this room, completely taken over by people under 4 feet who are related to me, and who are primarily, I would say almost exclusively, watching not linear television, not Blue Ant channels, but Netflix.
Okay. Kevin.
I'm Kevin Goldstein.
By the way, do you have anything to do with that other Kevin I've heard that works at your company?
You got to be more specific.
Well,
We got lots of Kevins.
Well, there seems to be a Kevin I've heard speaking somewhere. I think he's in the room. Anyway, go ahead.
He was in the room. I work for him.
Okay.
I'm Kevin Goldstein. I'm Vice President, Legal and Regulatory Affairs at Bell Media. My relationship with my television, I was going to actually say my kids took it over, but Asha already took that.
The beauty of doing first.
It's, I don't get to watch it as much as I used to, and I tend to fall asleep in front of it most nights on the couch. So.
Okay, good. Jay.
I'm Jay Thomson, and I do regulatory work for the CMPA. I'm less concerned about my relationship with my television now, and more concerned about what my relationship with my television will be going forward. And I hope that in that context, I hope that going forward that my TV will include Canada.
Excellent. Alysia.
Yeah, I'm Alysia Lau. I'm legal counsel with the Public Interest Advocacy Center, or PIAC. I grew up watching news every night with my family, and it's still a tradition, Cantonese news first, and then usually CTV news in the evening. And recently, for me personally, I tend to watch non-linear television, and I've become a big fan of the CBC, so I recently started watching X Company, and I think it's great.
Cool. John.
John Simcoe. I'm an assurance partner at PwC in our entertainment, media, and communications practice, working in that industry for 20 years now. My personal relationship with my TV, I have no concerns about whatsoever, except that I need to find a way to get some, because like Asha, I have a problem with folks under 4 feet kind of hogging it, and when I can, I usually grab Lisa LaFlemme at 11 p.m. on the news, and maybe sports on a Saturday night or a Sunday, and occasionally Orphan Black, because my wife loves that. So.
Cool. So the way we're going to kick this off is John is going to give a little bit of a scene setter from PwC's perspective and their work in talking to a lot of clients in the sector, and then we're going to get into our discussion. So first over to you, John.
Hey. Thank you very much. What I wanted to share with folks today, I've been leading a cross-discipline working group in our firm since last summer, really, when the hearings were just getting set up with the CRTC for Let's Talk. So we've been following it ever since and engaging with our clients, I'll say across the ecosystem, because we've certainly connected with every one of the major media companies, every one of the major BDUs, funders, as well as producers in the space. So really now, though, the focus of our engagement with them, and these are actually all, well, for the most part, they're clients of ours that we're actually doing work with, and most of our engagement with them now is focused on how's this going to affect you. And what are some of the things that they're seeing? What are some of the perspectives that we have on how it might affect them? The focus of our discussions has been on two areas that we expect to be in the decision. Probably we all expect, and that's skinny basic and pick and pay. Don't know about whether there'll be a maximum rate cap or not in either of these. Differing views, of course, on whether skinny basic will be all Canadian content or not. Also, whether there'll be a phased approach or not on pick and pay. But nonetheless, these have been the areas of the focus of our conversations. The only certainty in all this is simulcast is here to stay, as you've heard in the first of what seems like a series of decisions that will likely unfold over the coming weeks, and the whole value chain in the business will be affected. And really, the theme that we keep coming back to is disruptive. That this is going to be substantial enough change in the industry that it will be disruptive. Interesting thing I came across in preparing for this, though, was when written in Chinese, disruptive change, there's two characters to say disruptive change. The first character is danger and the second is opportunity. I kind of thought that was telling, because that's really what we see in all of this is that there really is some opportunity when there's significant change like this, and this will usher in significant change. I probably don't need to tell the folks in the room that. I'd like to focus for a second, and I'm just going to pick off a couple of points on these next couple of slides because of the amount of time that we've got. From a media company perspective, the most significant area that we've always had a discussion about for each of the players that we've been meeting with is around the BDU and affiliate negotiations and that aspect of the relationship. So a lot of trepidation, first about how do they prepare for that process? What are the different factors that are going to come into play when they have their next set of negotiations? In some cases, players saying, well, if it's a December 2015 versus December 2016 implementation by the CRTC, that'll affect me differently than some of my competitors because my contracts are up at a certain point in time, perhaps much closer to the first than the second. And so how does that play out if you're one of the players with the earlier renewal of your arrangements? And many of these arrangements for the larger players are now all essentially combined to some extent for all of their major channels. So that can be quite impactful, I think, for a lot of the media companies, and certainly is a point of focus. And the main thing that we've been talking to them about is the importance of scenario analysis in preparing for those. So that's really and they all know that. That's certainly something that is a key thing that they'll have in preparing. We look at the BDU side for a second, and I've got content negotiation here. That's really the flip side of what I just talked about. An interesting point here that has come up a few times is whether anybody will put on the table, because I think many of you may know that a lot of the rate cards in these arrangements, so to speak, are now penetration-based rates. And will anybody put on the table non-penetration pricing? So a flat rate card that will be predictable for a period of time for the BDU. And in turn, if somebody does that, could that affect where the BDUs are prepared to spend their marketing dollars? Envisioning a scenario where, assuming they're not only pick and pay, but they're also entitled to still have packages that they could promote. And then what goes into those packages, which ones do they get behind, et cetera, then becomes a very interesting scenario. And the other one that always comes up with these folks is the engineering aspect, which I won't bore you with, but suffice to say that somebody has to pay for all the stuff that's in the ground and the satellites in the sky, and somehow that has to get funded in order to maintain all this stuff. It's quite often taken for granted that that's just a fixed cost that somehow is going to continue. But in the long term, that's a key piece that they're focused on too. Consumer reaction. I think that the first part of this is no surprise to anybody here if you followed the hearings, and that there were a number of studies done by various players in the sector, some of whom are represented on the panel today, and the overriding scenario was, or theme of that was, that consumers were just fine with what they had, and I guess my personal perspective on this though is I think they might be kind of interested when they see what they don't know is what they don't know. So I think it'll be interesting to see how they react once the new environment's in place, and if there is an environment of pick and pay, then how to react. And one of those reactions that we're really looking to is a combination of different factors that could come together to potentially have an impact on cord cutters, cord shavers, or cord nevers. And is that a possibility whereby, if our skinny basic package is the same thing you get in rabbit ears, then forget it. This is going to have no effect. Because right now it's phenomenal reception in rabbit ears. But if we've got some other goodies in there, is it attractive enough? Does the pricing come out at a low enough floor that people are interested? That's another thing that I think is coming into the realm of the opportunity piece that I talked about. Just a bit of a global check, and I mention this because when you have disruption, there's opportunity again, and I think some of these may become relevant as players adapt to the new environment. In other centers, the UK and the US in particular, this change is already in effect, and the market has adapted, of course, but it was introduced without any regulatory interference. It was introduced by the marketplace, and so that's kind of an interesting factor. To some extent, this really exists in the province of Quebec today, as well as a reality. So I think those are interesting to reflect on. Some producers are offering their own content as well, over the top, and I personally think that's a growing theme. I think the current offerings over the top are much like our conventional television channels were 40 years ago. So I think it'll be, just in terms of the various genres of content that are available in those offerings. And is there a future for more agile offerings? Cable TV for a day has happened in Asia and Latin America in the last World Cup, in communities where there's virtually no cable, but all the homes were hooked up. So that's an interesting possible scenario, and there was no cable because no one can afford it, but they would set up in Joe's living room down the street and everybody would go there to watch games. And is that something, as you have change in the marketplace, that one of the BDUs can introduce or not? The other one is pay TV for a day, and that's something that's been done in a number of markets as well, with varying degrees of success. But I think interesting times, and again, leave you with that thought on the where there's danger, there's opportunity.
Thanks, John.
Thanks.
So what's interesting about that to me is John's talking about the opportunities. The hearing, when we talked about pick and pay, the evidence was resoundingly negative. In fact, I think there was some guy who's not an economist that had some stuff on the record about devastating job losses and whatnot. So what do you think? Is your perspective change? Is there the potential for upside, or at the end of the day, are we talking about a negative impact on revenues, a negative impact on Canadian programming expenses, and really it's just a matter of degree?
I think it depends what channel you are. I think overall, if you're to look at it, while there may be some opportunities for a small number of channels, I think largely there's going to be a lot of channels who aren't able to survive in that environment, who benefit today, or survive today largely through broad packaging, which is a model that's worked well for our industry for a long time, and industries all over the world, the broadcasting industry all over the world, specifically in the US. I think some services will be okay in that environment. A lot of it comes down to how you structure the wholesale arrangements with the distributors, because John was speaking about flat rate pricing. That may work for a channel that exists in an a la carte environment today, like a TMN or a Movie Central. A pay channel doesn't rely on advertising. I think what's been shown is the broader the penetration you have, the more advertising opportunity you get. Obviously, there's going to be a group of core viewers who are going to subscribe to your service and watch it regularly, but there's also a lot of people who surf and they discover channels and they choose to watch from time to time, and you can't do that if you don't get the channel. And so how that spins out and how that affects the industry overall, whether from BDUs to broadcasters to the production community, is going to depend a lot on the wholesale arrangements between the programmers and the BDUs. And a service that's in 80% of homes that offers its channel for X, if it's only in 40% of homes, cannot offer its channel for X. It will have a lot less advertising, but it still needs to fund that content. And you really need to kind of look at how, we like to think of it along a continuum. we have the over-the-air channels who have no subscriber revenue, which we continue to disagree with, but it is what it is at this point, who rely entirely on advertising, to a pay channel down the road that has no advertising. And if you want to get TMN from your distributor, it's $20. And if you want to get the over-the-airs, they're free over the air. But in between, there's a lot of gray. And if we want to move to an environment where channels move down to 50, 45, 40% penetration and have very limited access to ad revenue, but the viewers still want the same quality experience that they get today, we're going to have to find a way to fund that. And given that those channels, at least at this point, don't have a direct relationship with the subscriber, they're going to need to fund it through the revenue they derive from the BDUs.
So I would echo some of what Kevin said. One of the great issues for an independent broadcaster is, of course, and I fear that we're sort of getting boring because we keep repeating ourselves, but it is the notion that we do not have a direct relationship with our consumer. And the question of discoverability is a great challenge for us. So in a pick and pay environment, the importance of discoverability is going to increase 15-fold because you are now in a position where people are not discovering you because they're surfing and you're in a package, a good package or a bad package. So discoverability becomes even more important, and as a result, we as independent channels feel that there's potential for real disproportionate harm to Blue Ant's channels and other independents. So that's the danger. I keep sort of thinking about this hearing like a disruptive influence, because that's how it's working in the marketplace for companies like us, in the sense that we have said, okay, so we have increasing challenge not only from vertical integration and increased concentration, not only from fractionalization of the marketplace, now we're adding regulatory uncertainty to that and potential loss of the protections that we've enjoyed since the inception of the company. How do we counteract that? And it has built opportunity. We are, as a result, looking internationally and growing our international business at a much more accelerated pace, arguably, than we would have done had those multiple factors not existed. We are, so this is interesting, we are also focusing on creating and owning more content and ensuring that we are able to export that content internationally. Now, I know many in this room will think that's a bit counter to some of the themes in terms of trade, and that's not wrong. But it is sort of a market necessity for us. Also, I would say we are focused much more on programming that has international appeal. So I take the example of Cottage Life, which is one of our networks, which is a quintessentially Canadian offering. We produce and we commission clever lifestyle shows about cottage life in Canada. The name itself, Cottage Life, doesn't even resonate outside of this country. When we look at our model today, we say, okay, should we really be spending all of that money on creating programming that specifically appeals to a Canadian audience? Or do we really need to be funneling those dollars into our other enterprise that's looking at building international content? That, I would argue, runs counter to the themes of the Broadcasting Act. So there's a strange irony that's coming out of all this uncertainty, but it's sort of just a market reality.
So Jay, two things then. I mean, first I go back to Michael's comments at the beginning of the conference where he talked about, in a sense, the regulatory balance getting out of kilter, that for decades it was about a balance that maximized Canadian programming, and we seem to have lost that. So I'd like your comments, on in a sense, what you're telling your members they need to be thinking about in terms of the environment as it supports Canadian programming generally, and then maybe if you want to touch on the whole issue of how it affects terms and trade and relationships with independent producers.
Okay, well
and you got 2 minutes.
What was the question? Well, I'll start with terms of trade. And as we get into a regime in which revenues are squeezed for the BDUs and the broadcasters as a value chain, we look down the value chain, and we're at the bottom of it. They're going to look to find some ways to manage those reductions in revenues in their changing situation. And we are a natural target for cost-cutting measures and measures to increase the value that they perceive in the programming that they buy from us. And this is something that we raised at the hearing, is that as important as terms of trade have been up to this point, they're going to be substantially more important as we go into a much more uncertain environment where that market power difference is going to be intensified as a result of the economics. In terms of, sorry, what was the, the other question? Because that was such an important one that I wanted to get that one out first.
Your view on how this will impact the funding of Canadian programming generally?
Well, it's easy to be pessimistic about what's about to happen with the changes that we anticipate coming down the pipe. On the other hand, I mean, I've been in this business, it'll be 30 years this year, in fact, and I've been through a lot of regulatory proceedings where the objective and the result have been to establish a balance between the interests of all the parties. And when the notice was issued for this particular proceeding, it did indicate that there was supposed to be a balance here, and the balance was between providing choice, but also maximizing or fostering compelling Canadian content. And that balance seemed to get lost in the course of the hearing, and the focus was on choice. But the balance was still identified in the notice, and the chair's speeches that he made in Vancouver and London recently did make reference to the importance of the Broadcasting Act mandate of the Commission and the role of Canadian creators on television. So I'm hopeful that, notwithstanding the focus of the hearing, that the decision itself will actually continue to achieve that balance, and that there will be an upside for producers, and that there still will be funding opportunities and support mechanisms, notwithstanding the changes that we're about to face.
Okay. Alysia, I want to bring you into this. PIAC's been around for a long time, but never really touched on broadcasting matters until fairly recently. But in this hearing, you sort of became the default voice for consumers. I don't know if that's something you asked to become, or in a sense you were the default voice because you were the group that was appearing that was most representative of those interests. Do you see yourselves as a voice of consumers, and how do you, if you do, maybe you don't, how do you validate that voice?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because PIAC has been in telecom for so long, and representing consumers, and consumers in the telecom side, sometimes their interests seem to be so much clearer in the sense that it's a lot about, competition and choice and pricing. I mean, it started with rate regulation, right? And we had intervened on the broadcasting side here and there, and really wanted to, but found it really challenging to without some form of funding, which was great when the Broadcasting Participation Fund kicked in, and we were able to do more of that. But the interesting thing is that, on the broadcasting side, there are so many other interests to consider, including this really interesting sociocultural aspect to the broadcasting system. But, as advocates for, Canadians, I think as viewers and consumers, we kind of asked ourselves, well, who is the broadcasting system meant to serve? And the answer seems very plain. It's also in the Broadcasting Act, and it's just Canadians, right? So Canadian families, Canadian communities, Canadians from different ethnocultural groups. One of the members of our coalition is CEC, Canadians with disabilities. And so one of our chief concerns is trying to figure out how to ensure that the broadcasting system is responsive to Canadians as viewers and consumers, so their needs, their wants, their expectations. And that's a lot of what PIAC does on a day-to-day basis, which is kind of facilitating that, how to enable consumers and customers to help shape the services which they receive. Because of course in the BDO, which is kind of the cable, satellite, and IPTV companies, their relationship with customers, there's a huge imbalance of power, right? Because the BDUs tend to set the terms and the customers accept them. So there's no negotiation there. So that's what we kind of try to do. And that's our approach, yeah.
I want to turn a little bit to implementation. For those of you that haven't heard, the worst kept secret is that we're expecting decisions on the content side of the proceeding on March 12th. So that'll deal with presumably, I don't know, things like OTT and genre protection and some of the content-related stuff. And then we're expecting the big decision on pick and pay and unbundling on or about the 19th. So we'll have those decisions out presumably fairly soon. But then we're expecting a fairly long implementation phase, because the last part of the hearing was all talking about implementation. And very few things were expected to occur this fiscal. I think there was some thought that a skinny basic might occur this fiscal. But certainly when all the players were invited to scope out how they thought implementation could roll out on unbundling, you had forecasts going out as far as 2016, 2017. So, and then there's all the commensurate stuff. There's all the stuff that related, there's the renewals, there whatever. So does that give us some comfort in the sense that there's lots more decisions in fact that have to be made? All we'll have is a policy framework, and the actual decisions that get made later on, and there's time to reconsider some stuff if perhaps the Commission hasn't got the balance right. And does the long period mean perhaps a better shot at implementation that works? Who wants to take a crack at that? Let's start with Asha. Because she's next to me.
So the iterative way in which this decision has been rendered, I think, has been a great challenge for the industry. And the fact that it is continuing on that way, I understand the kind of administrative difficulty of completely rewriting a regime that's been existing for I don't know how many decades. But what I have found, certainly in our business, and Kevin and I spoke about it briefly on a call last week, is that it has had a very decelerating effect on the way that we are running our domestic business. It's sort of echoing the theme of what I said earlier, because in meeting after meeting, we talk about, so should we be rebranding X to Y? Should we be looking at programming decisions about Channel Z? And at almost every day, there's a decision that we say, oh God, we better wait till this decision comes out because we have no idea what the impact is going to be. Conversations with BDUs, conversations about marketing, conversations about packaging.
Commissioning shows.
Commissioning shows.
Yeah.
So the extent that continues, it has had a very, very stagnating effect on us, and I imagine on everybody else. So, maybe that's the most obvious point to be made, but so I worry about that.
I'm not sure that once the Commission comes out with their decision that I think that the industry is going to see that there's further opportunity to tweak around the edges on it. Because, for example, if you take a look at
appeals.
Well, there's always that possibility.
We'll get into that.
There's always that possibility.
We anticipate a few coming.
Yeah. We're counting on you, Kevin.
I see a lot of my colleagues in the room. They could jump in at any time.
Yeah, exactly.
Why should they?
I think that if you look, for example, at the SimSub Super Bowl decision, the Commission indicated it's going to implement that it's not going to be implemented in 2017, but the policy statement's really clear that that's what the decision is. We're going to be implementing something that's going to be, should this comma go here and that comma go there, and is this defined properly in terms of how we're going to apply this? But we know what that decision is. I would be really, really worried about a situation where we think that the Commission's coming out with these policies, which are going to create incredible upheaval and disruption in the system, and then we're thinking about how we might change those and other new things that may come out of it, over the period of implementation. The implementation is going to be long for a reason. It takes an extended period of time to negotiate affiliate arrangements, to make the commissioning cycles on programming. We're terrified in terms of, I totally agree with Asha in terms of how it's, everything we do is looked at through the lens of what these decisions might be, and whether we're doing deals, long-term agreements, whether it's for Canadian programming or American programming or program supply arrangements. And if you just look at what happened to us in the Super Bowl situation, the Commission doesn't seem to hesitate to actually reach into those agreements in the middle of them and say, oh yeah, we're changing the terms. So that's terrifying for us. It's a degree of regulatory uncertainty for the industry that has a trickle-down effect essentially on everything we do in terms of our relationships with BDUs and our relationship with producers, on both sides of the border.
Any other comments on this?
Yeah, I think from an implementation standpoint, there's regulatory implementation and there's business implementation. And we know that there's going to be a period of further proceedings that to implement the policy decisions and turn them into changed regulations. And for example, if genre protection or the genre exclusivity policy is eliminated, then the question becomes, well, what happens to services that change their genres, and they currently have certain Canadian content obligations? Do they take on the obligations of the new genre in which they move, or do they keep the ones that they've got? And if that results in a reduction of Canadian programming overall, that's something that's not good. So, I mean, there's a lot of regulatory proceedings that are going to happen, and there could very well be legal appeals that slow down the process too. But as this goes on, there's the business implementation to the broadcasters. From our standpoint, we're particularly interested in how that's going to go, because we're already seeing that the uncertainty around these decisions has caused delay in decision making on program production and program buying. And that's impacting on producers. And if this continues to drag out and drag out and drag out, because for perhaps legitimate reasons, because you don't know what's going to be the end game, you know, how many producers are going to be able to live through that delay?
So, I mean, what Jay's raising is, in a sense, there's two levels of impact on Canadian programming. Let's zero in on that. You've got whatever happens in terms of pick and pay and how it ever changes the penetration of those services. And then you've got everything else that might happen, be it changes of the genre protection, be it licensees asking for reduced CP requirements by virtue of a changed environment. Now you have to file corporate renewals. Is it next spring or the spring after next? Next fall.
Next spring. I think it's this fall.
Fall, that's what I mean. It's this fall. So, you know, that's a huge thing, right? Because assessments will be made. Now you don't have renewals till when?
It's another 3 years.
Another 3 years.
2017.
But if the
2017.
environment changes, you
Yeah.
might be going in there saying, you know, so to your point about sort of typical trickling down effect and whatever, I guess the thing that hits me with this is little changes could have huge consequences because of that trickle-down effect. Do you think the Commission understands that?
Wow.
I think sometimes we end up with unintended consequences from decisions that get made. I think one of the challenges going into this proceeding, not just for the industry, but the Commission and everyone, it was such a massive undertaking to do. And there were so many different interconnected parts to it. And I think one of the things, and we'll see over the next 2 weeks, that we're concerned about is this, at least from the Bell perspective, this wasn't an exercise in saying, let's just go have status quo because status quo is really great. You know, and whether even from the distribution perspective, there are lots of different, you know, things happening in our industry that are impacting the traditional broadcast model. And what we were hoping to have out of this proceeding, and we may still in terms of the decisions that come forward, is a forward-looking policy that says, this is how we're going to chart the course so that we can have a successful industry in Canada, and that means successful broadcasters, successful producers, and successful distributors that can compete not, you know, with, you know, their domestic competitors, but also the influx of international competitors who are coming across our borders. Instead, we seem to be spending a lot of time debating things that should never have even been on the table. Like we're having a debate about simultaneous substitution. Like we're having a debate on how we should be encouraging more free over-the-air transmission so people disconnect from the system. Like, those are things that are, like, I'm somewhat astonished that we're not looking at how we can have a regulatory system that encourages people to subscribe to cable, that encourages people to take not just Bell Media's channels, but Asha's channels and everyone else. And what that does is it creates a healthy system that funds production and that Canadians can continue to get the broad range of programming and entertainment that they have today. Instead, we're either looking at cutting, you know, elements of the foundation out from under the system or tinkering around the edges with things, you know, without addressing the broad problem. So,
to Kevin's point, I think that the way the Commission set this proceeding up, it was designed to help the industry adapt to the changing environment, and in particular, the move to more on-demand programming. and the opportunities and the demand for on-demand programming. And yet, the issues that we addressed were ones related primarily to linear scheduled broadcasting. And I don't know how those are connected, and I'm just hoping the Commission does know how they're connected and is making the right decisions to make that connection.
Oh, sorry, do you want to?
No, I was just going to say the last couple. I know you kind of interjected when there was a space. I'd just like to comment, if I could, just on the last couple. I think there's another interesting part. Just picking up on what Kevin said on the regulatory change. Actually, I don't know what the CRTC were thinking to answer that, but certainly now that we're in the pickle we're in, I think the most important thing they can do in many respects is stop the change after this. There needs to be that period if there's going to be adjustment, for the adjustment to happen, and there can't be more unpredictability introduced in the system. It's sort of what Kevin was alluding to, I think, by the threat of additional regulatory change piling on top of this. So, and when you get to the change happening and how that's going to happen, Jay, you mentioned about content buy and things being on hold. The other aspect I think that's interesting with content buy is two parts. One is once we're in this adjustment period, and some of the concern around players that that may suffer the consequences, may not be on the air ultimately in a pick and pay environment. One of the things that may expedite that, frankly, is if they've stopped buying content, if they're trying to preserve cash flow, they might be able to meet their CPE requirements with what they've already got on their shelf for a limited time. But the reality is, if you don't have must-have content in this environment, you're going to suffer the death a lot quicker. And that's why I thought it was fascinating what Blue Ant's doing in terms of the focus on content. The next program buy, and I'll switch gears for a second, but I think it's highly relevant for the major broadcasters in terms of U.S. programming with the studios, is in May. And that's only 2 months after the decisions are coming down. I think that's going to be a first fascinating look at what the strategy is going forward for each of the players. Because if someone comes out of that dominant in terms of the must-have programming and whatever that represents, if someone comes out of that with, I'll call it the NHL deal of the studio content, and what I mean by that is something that doesn't just look at linear television, but looks at a more well-rounded partnership, if you will, on second, third screen and what have you. I think that could really expedite the kind of change we're going to see and how quickly it's going to come about.
Pick it up on that. From a producer perspective, what are their strategies? What are the mitigation strategies for producers now? And you touched on genre protection. Are there genres that are more vulnerable than others? If your clients here were producers, what would you be advising them to be thinking about? And
Well,
your clients are producers.
Our clients are obviously producers, and we've been pushing for the last little while on the whole notion of having must-have content, that we have to make content that appeals to audiences and that will be in demand. And because they're of great quality and great storytelling, and broadcasters will want those programs and will want to have those programs to differentiate themselves in this new on-demand environment. And we're increasingly looking to export opportunities. So this is, again, another theme of our organization, is to...
Genre?
Well, we always fear that there are genres that are at risk, and we made those arguments back in the last group license renewal proceeding almost 5 years ago. In particular, children's programming is at high risk, potentially, as is feature film. If there's no obligation to program a service in a particular genre, then you're going to move into genres where you can have the most revenue opportunities. And if kids programming, you can't advertise alongside it, and maybe you're going to move to a genre where you can advertise. We have movie networks that offer fewer and fewer Canadian movies and more series, and they have one tiny little obligation, which is an expectation to license the feature films that they deem appropriate. And we're having problems getting feature films on those channels now. What happens if they don't have to even have that obligation?
But Jay, maybe I could ask a question. And
No, I'm asking the question.
No, I'm filing appeals, so. I understand where you're coming from. I understand, and it's probably going to be an unpopular comment, but the reality is that, and as even you said earlier, when you talk about demands in an on-demand world, and also in a pick-and-pay world where you have to have the must-have programming, the reason why certain broadcasters and certain channels move in a particular direction is because they follow what audience demand is, and things evolve over time. I remember when you asked for the children's programming, and specifically relating to the over-the-air licensees in terms of obligations relating to children's programming. Well, the over-the-air licensees had obligations relating to children's programming before we had Treehouse, YTV, Family, a whole bunch of other channels that focus on that all the time. I remember as a kid going home and watching children's programming on CBC. My kids, when my daughter was younger, I said, "Do you want to watch Treehouse on demand?" She used to refer to it as TV on command. She doesn't understand the concept. She doesn't understand the concept of live scheduled programming. Everything needs to be paused or on demand or watching it. And children's programming is readily available from a multitude of Canadian sources. And also, Netflix has an incredible children's offering. So, I understand why you would think that over-the-air licensees or traditional licensees who focused in that area in the past, should continue to do that. But those channels need to evolve to compete in this new environment, which is going to be inherently driven by, consumer demand and popularity. It's the reality of, if we want to stick with an old model where everything is broad packaging and we have 3 tiers, and then we're going to bleed people, we're going to bleed to places like Netflix who are offering a different all-you-can-eat, approach on that. And it's just, for us, we want to air and we want to acquire the best quality programming that attracts audiences and drives people to want to take our services.
30 seconds rebuttal, and then we'll move on.
Well, yeah, just quickly, we never argued that there should be new obligations on over-the-air services, for example, to do kids programming. We just want to make sure that there continue to be specialty services that are focusing in on that genre, and that they get the support, because again, in a pick-and-pay environment, if they're not supported in the way kids' education is supported by a broad base of taxpayers, then there's a real risk that that programming won't be
Break
made.
up this fight.
But also,
Break it up.
let's
Don't
guess which side of this I'm going to
I
be
know.
on.
Don't put your head on the fire.
Side with me.
I
It's our conference.
I'm filing an appeal.
Yeah, I know you were. Yeah.
and I also got a very nice cheese plate
Yeah.
delivered to my room. So for that, I will give you this.
I didn't get a cheese.
What is the role of the regulator? The role of the regulator is, from what I understand from this hearing, is to preserve consumer choice. And consumer choice cannot mean the tyranny of the majority. It cannot mean blockbuster, rented, American scripted dramas to the exclusion of all else. And if what we decide is that the market is going to 100% drive what we see broadcast by all of us in the broadcasting sector, we are going to decimate true consumer choice. And I think we just have to pause when we get into this free market debate. I'm hearing so much about free market. Let the market determine. Then why do we need a regulator? Maybe you would argue we don't. Genres that are at risk, documentary channels. Okay, very niche programming serves, I think many people in this room would agree, a vitally important role. Not going to make it in a true free market environment. Second response I would say is we talk about this idea that consumers are going to watch, the channels that are going to succeed are going to be the ones that provide consumers what they want. I just have to go back to the notion of discoverability. If they aren't able to even get initial access into channels that aren't being promoted and aren't being packaged, and in a pick and pay world when, presumably we're all sort of left to fend for ourselves. Although, let me just mitigate that. I really don't think there's any way that we're going to go to pure pick and pay. The bundles are still going to be allowed.
Yep.
But it is that question of, it isn't just a question of good programming. It's also about all of those other things, how we are marketed to consumers, how things are priced, how, discoverability.
I think she's decided with me.
I'm not sure I disagree. I'm not sure I disagree.
Stop, it's boring. Final question for me, and then I'm going to open it up. Over the top. We had this bizarre exchange with Netflix and Google at the hearing. We had the shot over the bow from the chair at his London speech. I think you'll know what I'm talking about. But can we just actually confirm the regulatory reality of, obviously you can only speak, Kevin, to Crave, but I assume it applies to Show Me. We heard Mike and Marnie today point to the fact that they don't have obligations, but want good content, want to mirror the broadcast rules. But as I understand it, Kevin, as an over-the-top service, services like Show Me and Crave, of course, are exempt on the digital media exemption order. But when they're delivered under this in the set-top box, it's under the rubric of VOD. So how does it fall under the cable company's VOD license, and is it all packaged in accordance with the rules there?
Yeah, that's the way it works. So in terms of, I can't speak to Show Me because I don't know the service as well. But in terms of Crave's, when it's made available through the Crave app or on a Samsung Smart TV, it operates as an unregulated exempt service under the digital media exemption order. When I go onto my 5 TV box or any other BDU that offers it and is ingested into their system, and I can access the Crave programming through the VOD platform, that is being offered through the VOD license that BDU has, which has various obligations associated with it in terms of Canadian programming and shelf space, in terms of done on an aggregate basis. So Crave is just a channel. And to be honest, it's no different in that capacity than when someone goes and watches TMN on demand on that same VOD platform, because that's how TMN offers its programming. It's not actually done under the TMN license. It's done under the BDU license that's offered that way. And in fact, you'll actually find between the various BDUs, they ingest as much content as they can, but sometimes, like I think with 5, it has all the Crave libraries. Other BDUs have chosen to not ingest all of the content, and some BDUs, I think Eastlink out east, just decided to authenticate to the app and doesn't have it on their set-top box at all. So.
Does anyone think that this is bizarre? Sorry, can I just jump in?
Why? It makes sense.
No, it doesn't make sense.
Doesn't
You've got one service
This is regulation.
that is
Makes total
exactly,
sense.
it's one service. And so when it's distributed through your set-top box, it's subject to your VOD license, which has Canadian library obligations and Canadian expenditure obligations. And with the exact same service is distributed on a different platform, suddenly it's free of all these obligations.
It's actually not the exact. It's actually not the exact same service.
Right.
For example, TMN Go is not necessarily the exact same service that you get in a set-top box on an on-demand. There's multiple different types of licensees, Jay, and do I think it's bizarre? I don't know. Do I think it's bizarre that Netflix has absolutely zero obligations in this market? Maybe. But I think we have to stop ignoring the fact that Netflix is a reality in this market and impacts not just a Crave or a Show Me, but the traditional linear broadcast model as well.
So the way to compete with Netflix is not to have zero obligations too. It's to make yourself a differentiated service by having good Canadian programming.
Which we actually do on Crave, along with the best from around the world, and have taken a different marketing approach and different approach in terms of programming the service than Netflix. So I would agree with you on that.
Anybody got a question? There's a mic somewhere. Cynthia's got a mic, if anybody got a question. Anybody brave enough? I think there's someone in the light. There's someone in the light there, emerging from the light that might Yeah, you're the one that's emerging from the light.
I feel like you're in the
It's the
witness
shadow of
protection
Doug
program.
Barrett.
Get out of the light.
Is that who it is? Okay.
The Broadcasting Act was last amended in 1991, which is before some people in this room were born, and certainly before anything that has been discussed in the past 3 days was even conceived or thought of. Now, there's a lot of legal brain power on that panel, and I've spent a bunch of my own time trying to think about how the commission, which remains bound to administer the principles in the Act, and Section 3 has lots of them, how does the commission navigate its way through something that was created before any of the underlying subject matter that it is thinking about has occurred? So that's the first part. And the second
You
part...
only allowed one question.
Well, the B part is part of the same question, which is, do you think that part of the exercise will be an effort to amend the Act, and do you think this government could ever be drawn into thinking about that?
So
Can I answer B first?
I'm going to answer because you asked a question.
Oh,
I'm gonna answer
okay.
this one. I personally think the Broadcasting Act is a genius of technological neutrality-based legislation. Whether it anticipated the changes that we faced or not, it is well equipped to handle it. And I would argue that we're way too early to be contemplating changes to the Broadcasting Act because we've got a regime that works. Obviously, all the broad principles have conflicts between them, but the Commission has the discretion to choose between the broad principles and, in fact, invoke principles that aren't even there, like the consumer. And obviously, with the power of licensing and exemption, they can control the system. So my personal opinion is, until we know where we're going with broadcasting, there's absolutely nothing wrong with the current act. And in any event, there's no way this government or any future minority government is going to change the act.
I kind of agree. I kind of agree. I just think that the elements of the act and sort of the whole underpinning of it and the reason why we needed it don't change in this environment. In fact, they probably become more important. It's totally technologically neutral. The commission can interpret it in that way. If the government has a different policy perspective on it, they can instruct the commission or amend the act. But to be honest, we haven't seen that out of a government in ages.
You want to comment?
I was just going to say, they chose to politicize, well, in my view, to politicize the regulator, this government, that is. I don't see why they shouldn't revisit some other legislation such that, for example, the Canadian license fee requirement is no longer necessary for financing. And should other requirements, like what's wrong with having an over-the-top deal, an international deal of some kind, and having your funding lined up otherwise through tax credits to be able to get funding? I don't understand what the problem with that is. So I think if they're willing to reopen anything to support producers in this environment, that would be a critical one in my view, to support the kind of must-have content production that we need.
Last question. The interesting thing about this hearing is actually there was, in my mind at least, a remarkable degree of unanimity on the broad principles because everything was on the table, because such foundational stuff about what broadcasting is about was on the table. A remarkable number of people came together. I was talking to Alysia earlier, and despite the consumer mandate of PIAC, they came to the defense of simultaneous substitution, saying that on balance it was good for the system. What's the risk that we lose that going forward? We already have 2 appeals going to the commission. Are we going to have more? And are we going to have actually a much more fractious environment as we navigate what become almost zero-sum games going forward?
Yeah, so the devil is in the details. Never has that been more true than about this hearing. Of course, we all agree consumer choice is a great thing. Of course, we all agree that we should support broadcasters and producers, and we should make sure that there's still lots of Canadian content being produced and it's getting better and it competes internationally. Yeah, that's easy. It's how are we implementing the principles of the Broadcasting Act? I don't know where the mystery guy went.
Mr. Barrett, he's still here.
And the negotiations that will have to ensue between our friends at Bell and Shaw and Rogers, that is when we are going to get, I think, mired in some really, really fractious issues, which is why the principles we put forward at the hearing.
More appeals?
I think it's highly likely we're going to see, a very, very combative environment going forward. I think there's a lot of, I think we all expected change. I think we're getting change we probably didn't expect. And I think, if the commission is kind of pushing the boundaries on things, if they're implementing rules that impact certain specific licensees, I think it's a natural defense mechanism for those to take whatever legal avenues are available to them. And also, if we get, increasing numbers of kind of complaints-driven policy, where, we've made, financial and business decisions based on what we thought the regulatory environment is, and it seems to be shifting sands underneath us. Yeah, I think we're likely to see a lot more challenges and a lot more fractious environment.
Jay, broadcasters and producers walking down the aisle together on terms of trade?
Well, over the last few years, we've really, I think, improved our working relationship with the broadcasters, certainly at the association level, and working with the teams in the regulatory groups at the broadcasters, and even the example of our settlement on the terms of trade dispute demonstrated that when parties come together and work out their differences and want to work out their differences, they can achieve success by working together. And I hope that isn't threatened by what we face. I think we have the same worries and same challenges, and I'm hoping that we'll continue to work together to face them.
Alysia, you're going to be going to a lot more broadcasting hearings?
Oh, yeah, we're gonna try to be there at as many as we can. I can't really comment on kind of, what the nature of relationships will be like within the industry. I think I will probably have the one positive thing to say about this whole process, and that is kind of our perspective, which is that, Canadians as viewers and consumers, as BDU subscribers and taxpayers, we need to listen to them, they need to be much more highly valued than at times I think they may have been. For a long time before CRTC proceedings, they didn't have a voice. So you saw groups representing multiple stakeholders appear before the commission and advocate for their interests, but consumers didn't have that voice for the longest time. And I think one positive aspect of this hearing that we really see is, we do need to take the time to listen to them, and it can be challenging. I mean, we recognize that, we understand that, but it's important. It's an important step forward, I think, so.
John, final word?
I'm just really hopeful that out of this there will be some new spirit of collaboration that comes about, and maybe the recent deal with Vice Media and your competitor, for example, might be an example of that. Where is there opportunities for producers to work more closely with some of the BDUs or some of the broadcasters at least, and will some of that come out of this? I'm hopeful it will. I thought it was actually fantastic to see Kevin Kroll here. In the past, I think you'll agree, many of his peers would not have been walking these halls. So I think that's a spirit of... What?
He was in the wrong room.
Okay.
Okay, well, thank you, panel. Thank you, audience, for coming. Big round of applause for our panel. Next is lunch, I understand, and you know where it is. Enjoy.
That was really well done.
Don't touch.